take the Pepsi coup in 1973.
Okay.
We overthrew the government of Chile. We toppled, the Allende government. And, 30 years later, 35 years later, files were declassified that showed that the chairman of the Pepsi Cola company had lobbied the Secretary of State to that U.S. national interests in the form of Pepsi Cola bottling operations were going to be devastated if Allende was allowed, was allowed to remain in power, and I forget if he was nationalizing some element. But basically, Pepsi had these bottling operations there. It was going to massively, tank their capacity to produce the cans for Pepsi bottles, and so a meeting was organized between I think it was the CIA director at the time and the chairman of Pepsi Cola. Everyone can look up the Guardian article on this. Just type in Pepsi Coup Chile, and so the chairman of Pepsi and the head of the Central Intelligence Agency have a planning meeting about the best way to overthrow a government in order to preserve Pepsi's profits. And they even bring in to the meeting, the meeting minutes show, they bring in basically the State Department's media guy for the region, who ran a web of print media and radio stations, so that the media guy could be brought into the propaganda that was being co-generated effectively by the CIA and Pepsi. Well, I mean, this plays out everywhere as multinational corporations can benefit from U.S. government pressure on foreign companies applied to them.
That's clearly true. I think that American business interests have a very obvious recent history of trading short-term profits for long-term strength. Selling all your industries to China at 40 cents on a dollar, clearly makes a small number of people rich, but it's not a long-term plan for prosperity, actually.
Well,
they're just not good at this.
In a way, it's a miracle that this is happening, because it's forcing us to confront all the related issues as we put together a more cohesive vision for U.S. soft power, which is that Reaganite-style trickle-down economics 1980s thing may have made sense when those corporations were American corporations with American manufacturing facilities employing American labor. But now these are nominally, American companies, but they are not, but there's no trickle down, because it's not like that's substantially increasing American jobs when they're going overseas to East Asia.
American jobs in the first place.
Right. Or it's not, providing, enhancing the security of our supply chains, because it's giving more for our factories to produce, because we don't have the factories anymore. No. And so Trump is doing all this in tandem. He's trying to onshore things. He's trying to bring back domestic manufacturing. And some of that may be how we approach statecraft, which is that, the kinds of entities that we consider to be U.S. national interest are the ones that, have a certain amount of American investment. You can't be a sort of American in name only, and have so much of your workforce in China, or have so much of your operations. I mean, there may be a sort of we need to sort of have a cohesive vision of what national interest is if we're not going to
completely agree. I mean, companies basically owned by the sovereign wealth funds of our rivals, who are only here to benefit from our enforcement of copyright, et cetera, are no sense really American. Why are we wrecking the world for their benefit? So in September, we went across the country, coast to coast, 17 different cities on a nationwide live tour, and it was amazing. And we brought the entire staff with us, like we always do, because we all worked together for so long and enjoy traveling together. And one of our producers is a documentary filmmaker. And so he decided to make a documentary film about our trip, a full month across America with some of the most interesting people around. Different people joined us every single night. Bongino and Russell Brand and Bobby Kennedy and J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. We had the best time, and the fruit of that is a documentary called On the Road, the Tucker Carlson Live Tour, which is available right now on TCN. On the Road, Tucker Carlson Live Tour. It is hilarious. You will like it.
People have been lied to in this country, where they've thought that they've been sold that this was humanitarian aid, and and co-signed it. And let me come back to this point about the pencil, because maybe that'll just appear a little bit later in the story, and I'll just sort of hint at it now. But right now, the people who are trying to defend USAID are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They want to defend it on humanitarian grounds, and then they get totally deluged with all the ways that it has gone wrong and all the horrible things that's funding. So then they then turn to layer two. This is sort of like Lindsey Graham defending our operations in Ukraine when it was, we need to do this for democracy. And then we say, okay, well, you canceled elections. There are all of these non-democratic things that are happening. And he goes, okay. Layer two of my defense is there's $14 trillion worth of natural resources under the soil there. So,
right.
Having it be a U.S. vassal state is advantage to us because then we can exploit those $14 trillion worth of resources. I mean, that's what's implied there, right? Why would Americans benefit from Ukrainians exploiting that $14 trillion? Now, and by the way, that's not a knock on Ukraine, but you simply saw that shift happen when, as it got harder and harder to defend it on the basis of democracy promotion, the mask had to slip in order to defend it at the deeper level. It was to let people in. Okay, here's why we're really doing it. And every USAID program operates that way. It is getting back to this rock and the hard place analogy. Is that they want to say it's humanitarian aid, but it's clearly done so much harm in so many places. It's doing such terrible things. Funding the Wuhan lab. Not to mention, the whole rest of the USA Truman Show. But then they go, okay, well, it's U.S. soft power. It advances U.S. strategic interests. And so you say, oh, okay, so it's not aid? And then it becomes very schizophrenic to defend this thing because it's a labyrinth of lies. USAID's access and its reputation completely depends on its perception as being a kind of quasi-charity, even though, it's nowhere. Charity is nowhere to be found. It's a U.S. foreign policy instrument. Aid isn't even in the name. I've said this many times, but it's the Agency for International Development. And when you see aid,
yes,
is your mind playing tricks on you?
And by the way, growing up, my dad worked with USAID. It was called USAID, not USAID,
right?
To make it clear to everybody, it was not an aid organization.
Right.
But now they call it USAID.
Right. Well, I'm sure in the Ronald Reagan building, but how it's colloquially known. I mean, and how it's described to the voters. It's described as humanitarian assistance. And you go, okay, well, and we can get into the depth of the scandals, but I guess the fundamental feeling that I have right now is this is going to get a lot worse as people go through this self-discovery process of what's happening. And we were talking a little bit earlier where I mentioned, 8 years ago when I was writing my, little book attempt to try to explain everything that was happening in internet censorship, and I felt like I had to explain all these other, tectonic plates of American society and global affairs just to understand who and what and why they're censoring the internet. But, I would spend my whole day in usaspending.gov, to the exclusion of everything else, friends, family, a social life, and just going through that. This can't be true. This can't be true. Oh my God, it is. Oh my God, it is. And there's a sort of 5 stages of depression that plays out as you discover it yourself, going into these grant databases and seeing the receipts with your eyes like that, because that's what I've seen on my news feed this week. It's been just hundreds of people, all with huge megaphones, who are just spending their day like hearing about, oh wow, there's all this corruption at USAID. Let me plug it into the search database. Let me fish around a little bit. Oh, here's what I found. And now everyone's contributing to this common knowledge, which is really amazing.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. We hope you'll subscribe to it. And by the way, you can hit the little bell on there and get notifications every time we produce a video. We hope you'll do that also.